What's that like? What's going on, people? Hey, it's another edition of the What's That Like podcast, and I am your host, John Knowles. Thanks again for listening each and every time we put out a show. Thanks for all the support we had on the last show. We got a lot of great comments, a lot of listens, and I want to thank my past guest. You heard her, Kaylin Chardon, Three Timers Club here at the What's That Like podcast. Always does a great job. She wrote that book, Haunted Carlinville, History and Hauntings in Macoupin County. I know she had some book signings. She got tours going on. Support Kaylin, everything you do. I know all of you out there in WTL Nation certainly take care of the folks that support the show as well. So thank you. This week, I've got a show that I think is going to be a big turning point in kind of the subject matter that we have covered in the past. We like to have fun. We talk about some fun things, some history, some of the good history, sometimes the bad history of the area. This is going to be the history of a landmark event in the world of ufology that happened in January of the year 2000. In Highland, Illinois, a fellow by the name of Melvin Knoll walked out of his business that he was checking on. It's January. It's cold. He wanted to go make sure everything was okay. Came out and spotted a UFO that he described as big as a floating house flying over the town of Highland, Illinois. Reported it to the police department. And then a series of police officers all across central Illinois tracked an object visually over the course of about an hour. And my guest today is David Marler. David wrote a book called Triangular UFOs, an estimate of the situation. And he's been researching these black triangle UFOs going back well over 100 years. He's not been going back over 100 years, but he's got reports of them that date back over 100 years. And his interest really kicked off because at the time he was the Illinois director of the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON. And of course, this one happened right in his backyard. He started the investigation, talked to all the police officers involved, some civilian witnesses as well, looked at radar tapes, had all this information. It all goes into his book. Once again, Triangular UFOs, an estimate of the situation. And David was kind enough to spend the better part of an hour and 15 minutes with me. And we discussed that case, a whole lot more about the world of ufology. And I think you're going to enjoy it a lot. I'm going to structure this episode a bit differently. Normally I come right out and say, hey, David Marler, UFO researcher, what's that like? We're going to cover that. We're going to get to that. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to play you a recording. And this recording is of the radio transmissions between all the officers involved in this visual tracking of these objects that were seen on the morning of January 5th, 2000. I got this from David. This recording was obtained via the Freedom of Information Act by a partner of his in the research of this incident. I'm going to start it off with that to really set the stage. And then we're going to get to David himself and really talk through not only the events of that day, but how he got into it, what it's like to become a UFO researcher, and then really his journey through this over all the years. Of course, he wrote the book, and then he's doing a lot of continuing things today in the field of ufology. And a lot of it stemmed and put him on a different plane after that January 2000 incident. So let's go ahead and play you that recording, and then we'll get all into David Marler and figure out what it was like to track this incident all the way through. What you're going to hear at the start is the dispatcher in Lebanon, Illinois, asking Officer Ed Barton to go check out something in the skies.
Well, I just received a call from Highland PD. Reference to a truck driver just stopped in and said there was a flying object in the area of Lebanon. It was like a two-story house. It had white lights and red blinking lights, and it was last seen southwest over Lebanon. Leslie, could you check the area?
Did you say if the truck driver was DUI or anything? Just a quick question. If I happen to find it, what am I supposed to do with it? If I see it, I'm not saying a word. 6-year, also be advised about the last thing that went over Lebanon, this was approximately 5 minutes ago, was a military cargo plane. It looked like a C-5. So be advised, there's a very bright white light east of town. Looks like it's just east of Summerfield. And it keeps changing colors. I'll go there and see if maybe it's an aircraft. It doesn't look like an aircraft, though. So that's affirmative. Not the moon, it's not a star. CENTCOM 5404. Would you contact Scott Air Force Base to see if they have anything flying in this area, please? 10-4, well, whether it's a plane or not, it's heading westbound now. It should be really close to Scott now. Matter of fact, if the shadow officer looks up, they can probably see it by now. Good enough. 18550. I see something, but I don't know what that is. Probably heading Lambert. CENTCOM 6004.
Go ahead.
I've got that object inside also.
Are you serious?
It's huge.
6004, does it look like, what does it look like to you?
It's kind of V-shaped. Looks like it's possibly headed toward Lambert.
10-4, that's what Shiloh 7 was heading towards Cherokee Heights.
Really? CENTCOM 6004.
Go ahead, 6004.
Does Dupo have a Polaroid?
That I don't know.
6004, 3923 on County 2. 6004, then. I'm not sure this thing, item that you say it's one here appears to be pretty high in the area. When I first seen it, I looked binoculars, you can see the different colors. Now this appears to be white. Very large. It's hard to tell, it's pretty far off in the distance. This object was above me about 500 feet, and it was huge. Okay, for it. This down up here, it's probably 20 or 30,000 feet up right now. It's high as usually the planes are. It's not low at all.
David Marler, thanks for joining me today here on the What's That Like podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, it's something that I've really been pointing toward for a long time. The show is, I don't know, about a year and a half old. And one of the things, number one, a lot of requests for it from folks that listen. Number two, it's kind of a personal thing for me as well. I've had an interest in this subject for a long time. And as I started making the list of who I wanted to get on the show, I put one name at the top of the list, and it was yours, and just hoped you'd come on. So I really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Yeah. David, like I said, I've been interested in this for a while. I'll tell you just my story right up front. It starts about 4 or 5 years ago. I think it was October of maybe 13. I'm in my backyard, got a hot tub. I'm sitting in the hot tub. I'm just kind of watching the nice clear Illinois skies on a Tuesday or Wednesday evening. I saw something I'd never seen before, and I didn't see lights, but I would tell you this story is if you took a piece of paper and you held it over your head, the stars just started blacking out as something moved from north to south right over where I was. And I stood up and I watched this kind of what I'll call blacked out stealth looking object just go north to south and just block out stars for a while until I could kind of just see a slight reflection off it as it moved south. Freaked me out. I've been on a path to kind of figure out some of this stuff ever since. That's why I've got you on the show today more than anything. I don't know if you've heard anything like that. We can certainly talk about it, but it is certainly something that sparked my interest in this phenomena.
Well, I will tell you that when you mentioned that you were in the hot tub, I've probably over the course of several years now interviewed at least 2 other people that happen to be in their hot tub. And just like yourself, just in a reclined position that just happened to be looking up in the sky at a certain time and seeing something that they couldn't readily identify. So, yeah, it's kind of funny you say that. I remember there was even I believe it was a Missouri Highway Patrol officer off duty that was at his home, and he and his wife were in their hot tub in Columbia, Missouri. And I remember interviewing them, and they were just talking about being in a nice, relaxed environment, looking up at the stars, much like yourself, and seeing something they couldn't readily identify. So, yeah, when people are outside, they're looking up, and if you happen to be at the right place at the right time, you might see something unusual.
You just never know. I tell you, the first thing I did, jumped up, turned off the hot tub, just to make sure. Was it making a sound? Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Yeah.
just stone silence, and
Yeah.
it's been bothering me ever since to really kind of get some answers there. But as I said, I came to you. I purchased your book, and we can talk about that as the show goes on.
Sure.
Triangular UFOs: An Estimate of the Situation. Tell me how you got into this. The show is titled "What's That Like?" What's it like to be a UFO researcher? How did you get started?
Well, to kind of, step back several decades, it really started when I was 5 years old back in 1973. And at that time, I would just say I was just a young, curious kid, and then developed into a UFO enthusiast, and then later became actively involved as an investigator and a researcher. But way back in 1973, and some of your older audience members may remember this, there was a wave of UFO sightings in and around the small southeastern town of Piedmont, Missouri. And the reason I mentioned your audience may be familiar with that is it garnered a lot of media attention in St. Louis, both newspaper as well as television news reports. And back in the early 70s, mid 70s, UFOs were really a hot topic. And in 1973, they were doing a lot of news coverage. My father, who lived in the greater St. Louis area on the east side, in small town Fairmont City there, he had heard about these reports, and what really piqued his interest, he always was kind of open-minded but skeptical, but what really piqued his interest, the first primary witness in this wave of UFO sightings was the local basketball coach, and his name was Reggie Bone. And my dad grew up with Reggie. They were like best friends growing up as kids. And so I remember him telling me, if Reggie said he saw something, you can take that to the bank.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, in addition to my father's aunt and uncle who lived in the neighboring town of Mill Spring, Missouri, they had observed things. They knew of other people that had observed very strange things, both lights and objects in the sky around that same time frame. So it was enough to where it piqued my father's interest, and my father and my brothers and my sister were piling in the car on weekends that spring and summer to kind of quote unquote look for UFOs down there. And many people were traveling down to Piedmont and the surrounding area in the hopes that they might be able to see what was being reported in the newspapers and on the television newscasts. So it was a kind of an exciting time. And they would come back after making these trips down there, and they never saw anything themselves, but they would, talk about stories from people they had met down there who had related their own personal sightings, including my father's aunt and uncle, who had seen some unusual things at the time. But that was my first introduction at 5 years old to, what we now call UFOs. I was like, what's this UFO stuff? And, at 5 years old, obviously you're young, you're imaginative, you're impressionable. And it just left kind of an indelible mark on me. And then, it was about 1977. My sister had a close encounter with UFO with her husband outside Kansas City, Missouri, where something, we still don't know what, something was directly over their car and had a spotlight lighting up their vehicle and the entire surrounding area. And 1 year after that, there was another wave of UFO sightings, and in this case, cattle mutilations up around Ellsbury, Missouri, just across the river there on the Missouri side. And so that had garnered a lot of local media attention as well. And of course, I was much older then. I was 10 years old and remember hearing these stories. And so it really wasn't one instance that really solidified my interest. It was a series of events growing up that really piqued my interest. And then later in life, I became actively involved in the UFO subject.
Yeah. It sounds like it's been you said it. It's been with you your whole life since you were 5 years old. So that's you
So
can
to
remember.
speak.
What's your non-UFO related life like, David?
Well, actually, it's pretty mundane. I work for an international medical company, and I originally started in the clinical realm. I'm a registered sleep technician, and I ran sleep studies for a large university in St. Louis for a number of years, and later managed a sleep lab there in St. Louis. So I'm used to dealing with things that I can observe, things I can measure, and not used to dealing with lights in the sky and mysteries like that. So
Yeah.
I really come from more of a clinical background in that regard. My degree's in psychology, and later in life, transition into the medical sales field. So I'm used to dealing with physicians and clinicians, and nothing close to the UFO subject whatsoever.
Yeah. Where'd you grow up in Illinois?
Actually, Fairmont City.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. Just down the road from, Collinsville, just across the river
Yeah.
from St. Louis.
We're right here in the heart of what we call What's That Like Nation. So as you said, you kind of started getting into ufology 5-10 years old. How did you officially move into being a researcher?
Well, later in life, I would keep tabs on what was being reported, both in the newspapers, growing up, and then documentaries that would be on television, usually late night television, back in the 70s and 80s before cable really took over. They were sparse. They were few and far between, but I would try to catch and keep up to date on what was being reported. It wasn't until 1990, one of the local newspapers ran a story on a gentleman that worked for the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON. And my mom actually put me onto that. She said, "Hey, do you hear about this? Do you know about this organization?" And I had never heard of the organization before. And I remember thinking to myself, you mean there's actually a group of people that have a shared interest like myself that actually go out and investigate these things? And so when I found out about that, I think I was signing up the next week for the organization, and I wanted to be an investigator, and began investigating local cases. And then a few years after that, actually took over as the Illinois state director and managed the entire group of investigators and state section directors in the state of Illinois, and, trying to organize an investigative group of individuals to go out and investigate cases. And it was during my time as Illinois state director that we had, of course, that famous January 5th, 2000 incident.
Yeah, I want to get to that, but before we do, what's it like to be a UFO investigator? How does it work? Let's say I call you up with the incident that I had. What happens
Sure.
next?
Well, I always like to characterize it that we take a conventional approach to an unconventional topic. We're really not that dissimilar from a police investigator. Like you alluded to, if you were to call and report something, we're going to take down your information. Ideally, we'd like to meet with you to verify you are who you say you are. And in the most ideal circumstances, we like to be on the scene as soon as possible after an event transpires. And ideally, we want to be on site, on location, so we can really get a lay of the land, if you will. But it's really not that dissimilar from being a police investigator. And I've even had police investigators tell me that. It's like, you really do what we do. Unfortunately, we have that stigma that's associated with the UFO subject, where people think you're wearing tinfoil hats and you're chanting and meditating out in the middle of a cornfield where a UFO was sighted. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. We really kind of take a mundane approach to the subject in the respect that we're going out, we're interviewing an individual, we're trying to find corroborative testimony. In other words, if you reported the UFO, did someone else in the area possibly report it? We check with military, we check with commercial airports to see if there were any aircraft in the area at the time. We correlate your sighting, depending on the nature of it, with astronomical data. Was the International Space Station flying overhead at the time? Is that possibly what you observed? And look at all of these mundane explanations. The goal really in a UFO investigation is to establish what you did not see. Mm-hmm. If we can rule out commercial, military planes, satellites, atmospheric phenomena, and weather balloons, all of these prosaic explanations, which I will tell you are reported as UFOs. People do report weather balloons as UFOs. I've had numerous reports of the planet Venus that people swear is a UFO. When we can systematically, though, go through all those explanations, we can pretty much categorically state, we know what you did not see. But once we check all of those explanations off the list, then we're left with a genuine unknown, or UFO. And that's not saying it's equating to an extraterrestrial spacecraft.
Right.
Most witnesses that report UFOs, just for the audience's sake, I want to convey this. Most people that report UFOs do not say they saw an alien spacecraft. They say they saw something that they can't identify. And when they reach out to a UFO investigator, they're usually just wanting us to find an explanation so they can put their mind to rest, much like your own sighting. You would love to know, what was that I saw? Was it military or was it something else?
Well, that's my first guess,
yeah. Usually people are scratching their heads trying to figure out, what did I see? And so they come to us for an explanation. And unfortunately, sometimes we can offer an explanation, but other times we're left scratching our heads as well.
MUFON's a private organization, right? No government funding.
No government funding whatsoever, and that's really a good point you bring up, John. There have been government investigations of UFOs, military investigation of UFOs, but MUFON is a civilian organization. I was with MUFON for many years. Now I'm an independent investigator, researcher, but they have chapters throughout every state in the country, as well as other countries where they have representatives, and they're really trying to gather the data and look at this. And another institution that is very instrumental in that is the National UFO Reporting Center. My friend Peter Davenport runs that organization, and it's a clearinghouse for UFO reports. And MUFON and the National UFO Reporting Center work together in trying to share data and really try to collect these reports to see what we're dealing with.
And what happens with that data? Is it just there for someone like yourself that's going to come in and try to put some pieces together?
Well, it's funny you bring that up. I was recently in Devil's Tower, Wyoming UFO conference where I spoke, and a number of my friends and colleagues were there, and I was telling the audience, and when I made the statement, I saw a number of my colleagues nodding their head, kind of like saying, "Amen, I hear what you're saying." I often will challenge the UFO community of researchers that it's great that we continue to collect these reports. But if you're just collecting a new light in the sky report and putting it in a file cabinet, what good is that? We literally have decades of international UFO reports, hundreds, thousands of UFO reports. And my job in writing my book was to take one small subset of that data and, to your point, start trying to connect the dots, seeing if there are patterns in the data, because it's great you collect the data, but the next step is now to kind of analyze it. And like I said, I challenge the UFO community. We need to be doing more of that. There's no point continuing to collect reports if you're not really running them through a filter, if you will, and trying to see, are there patterns in the data? Because this is the big $64,000 if some of these UFO reports are someone else's technology, and I'm just going to leave it ambiguous intentionally there. If we're dealing with another intelligence behind some of these reports, there must be logic. There must be some pattern to the data. In other words, it's not just going to be a chaotic random series of reports. And like I said, with the triangular UFO reports specifically, because they do seem to be on a rise over the last 10, 20 years, I really wanted to kind of focus my research abilities on that subset of data and start looking at those historical reports.
Okay, so let's come back to the triangles, because January 5th, 2000 is a seminal event here in Illinois, and really spurred your interest in triangles in a go-forward manner, correct?
It did. As I state, that case really made it personal for me. I already had kind of a burgeoning interest in the triangular UFO reports, primarily because of 10 years prior to that, from 89 to 91, there was an unprecedented wave of UFO sightings over Belgium. And the Belgian military was actively investigating it in conjunction with civilian UFO researchers, which was unheard of when you compare that to the history of the military involvement in UFOs here in the United States.
Right, yeah.
Where they're much more tight-lipped. They're not, as willing to release information. And that was an unprecedented wave of UFO sightings. And in fact, just a little side note, I just got an email the other day from the lead investigator on those cases, who later I come to know after writing my book, Patrick Ferren in Brussels. And he just emailed me the other day, and they're doing a reanalysis of some of that casework as we speak. And hopefully they're going to be issuing a new report in the next year or so on that. But my interest was already piqued by that, because this was a complete departure from the traditional flying saucers that people usually, that's the image that's evoked in our minds when we hear about UFOs. But these triangular UFOs were something completely different. These objects, whatever they were reportedly 200 to 300 feet in length. They were reported by civilian, but also the gendarmerie, the police officers throughout Belgium, and also being reported by military. And these things were flying very low altitude. They seemed to be moving at a very leisurely pace. They had some very unusual flight characteristics, which we can maybe talk about when we talk about the January 5th, 2000 incident. And the reason I say that is, when I was investigating these police officers in Southern Illinois, what really struck me as I was sitting in the police departments taking their testimony, the comparison, the correlation with the earlier reports by the gendarmerie in Belgium. And that is what started me looking at this possible link, if you will, to these reports, that many of these witnesses are essentially describing the same thing down to minute detail as far as lighting characteristics and flight dynamics. And so, but to your point, the January 5th, 2000 incident, this was virtually occurring in my backyard, and now it became personal.
Yeah. What were you doing on January 5th, 2000? 4 a.m.
I actually think, well, this occurred in the early morning hours.
Yeah.
I think I was asleep at that point. I think the night before I was out with my girlfriend at the time in St. Louis, going out to dinner. But by 4 a.m. I was in bed. And at that time I was living in Edwardsville, Illinois.
Right.
And so I pretty much slept through the entire event, as I guess most people did. But no surprise to your audience, who's out late at night at 4 a.m. on highways and roads? Police officers.
Yeah.
And that, of course, made up the bulk of the witnesses in this particular case.
So run down kind of the chaining of events that made this event. There's documentaries on it. If you go to YouTube,
Sure.
Your friend David Barker's got a documentary. There's was it a History Channel or Discovery Channel did an episode on this, and it really in our backyard here in Illinois is kind of a seminal UFO event that we pay attention to, but it really is at large a very famous incident worldwide. So take us through what
John,
happened.
Absolutely. Well, I have to tell you, to your point, it has become kind of a landmark case, which is ironic looking back 18 years back on my investigation of this case, because at the time you're in the moment, you're collecting data, you're collecting information, you're trying to piece all this together. When you're in the moment, you don't stop to think, hey, this is going to be a real classic case that we're going to be talking about 18 years later. But here we are, looking back on it. But it really started, as I referenced earlier, very early in the morning, 4 a.m. roughly is when the sequence of events started. And one of the things that sets this case apart from many others is, yes, we have multiple eyewitnesses, but again, many of whom were police officers. But we have a series of events where you can literally connect the dots. And you've seen in my book where we can actually establish a flight pattern of this object,
Right.
because we did have multiple witnesses in neighboring towns that sequentially were observing this object or objects. But it started just to the northeast of Highland, Illinois. There was a gentleman who owned a miniature golf course in Highland. And of course, this was January, so this was the off season. And during the off season, when the miniature golf course wasn't in operation, he was an over-the-road truck driver. He had gotten back into town just before 4 a.m. and decided, due to the cold temperatures that morning, no surprise, January in Illinois, he thought he might run by the business establishment just to make sure the pipes were okay, to make sure that they hadn't ruptured or anything like that. So he pulls his pickup truck into the parking lot of the miniature golf course. And just as he was walking in, he just happened to catch a light out of the corner of his eye, high into the northeast. Didn't think too much of it, but it was enough to where, it did kind of catch his attention momentarily. But after that, he went into the business, checked all the pipes. Everything luckily was fine. There was no ruptured pipes, no water leaks or anything of that nature. And so very quickly he exited the building and for whatever reason decided to look back to the northeast. He saw what apparently was the same light, but now it was larger. And as he stood there for a number of seconds, he noticed it seemed to be slowly moving. And as he stood there and continued to watch this light approach, it moved just to the south of his position, and the light apparently was affixed to a much larger structured object. He described it as looking like a flying house. It appeared to be rectangular, with rectangular windows down the side that appeared to be illuminated from within. And he said this object just skirted over the trees that lined his miniature golf course to the south. And he watched this, I'm sure his jaw was hanging wide open as he was doing so. And he watched this thing silently, and that's another key feature with these sightings, silently just float over these trees. And then he watched it as it slowly disappeared to the southwest. And he stood there for a few seconds, and the documentaries that I've worked on that recreate this episode or this series of events, they never really make note of this. But I always like to say he was the hero in the story. If there's a hero in every story, it was this gentleman, Mr. Melvern Knoll. And we can use I'd like to emphasize, we can use the names of these witnesses. When people report UFOs, we usually will, keep the reports anonymous or keep their names confidential. But in this case, all of these witnesses have gone public. So I just want to let your audience know I'm going to reference these witnesses by name because they have gone on record publicly. But Melvern Knoll was the hero of the story because he had the decency of mind, after seeing this object, to immediately hop into his vehicle, drive to the police station in Highland, Illinois, and report it to the police officers. And more importantly, ask them, can you please check with Lebanon to see if their police officers can see this object because it apparently is heading in their direction. So I always like to credit Melvern as being the hero of the story. If he didn't do that, we might not have as many witnesses as we do to this event. And taking Melvern's suggestion, the dispatcher in Highland radioed the police officers in Lebanon and stated, we've got a man in here reporting an unidentified flying object. And Ed Barton, Officer Ed Barton, now deceased, was the police officer in Lebanon at the time. And he was right near Illinois 4. And he saw a bright light moving in the general direction where Melvern had said this object was heading. And taking a series of turns and side roads, he wound up on Old Route 40, just east of Lebanon, near the small village of Summerfield. And he saw this light, this very bright light. And at first he said it doesn't appear to be the moon, and it's not a star or planet. And he eventually pulled his vehicle off to the side of the road and turned the engine off, an important aspect to mention, and got out of his squad car and watched as this bright light, which was moving towards him, moved almost directly overhead. And he could discern that there was a triangular shape to this object, and there were 3 bright lights on the underside with a red light in the center. And it was completely silent, and he's watching this object. And at the time, he radios the dispatcher, I should say, St. Clair County Dispatch, to see if Scott Air Force Base has any aircraft in that area. They reported negative after calling Scott. Scott Air Force Base denied having any aircraft in the area at the time. And as he's observing this object, it makes a flat pivot turn. It doesn't bank like a conventional aircraft. It just pivots and then suddenly flashes. And 1 minute it's close to him. The next minute he sees it disappearing, heading towards the area of Shiloh, Illinois. So we're talking about a massive rate of acceleration. Yet there was no sonic boom, which is interesting, but indicative of this type of UFO report with these large triangles. And after that, Officer Ed Barton says, well, whether it was a plane or not, it seems to be heading westbound now. It looks like it's very close to Scott Air Force Base. And at this point, Officer David Martin, another police officer from Shiloh, Illinois, states, I see something, but I don't know what the heck it is. And he watches this object move very, very slowly, and then it accelerates and stops again a little further down the road. And then after a few moments, it then shoots away again and disappears out of his viewpoint. Well, as you can appreciate, this is on the police radio. So Many police officers are listening to this chatter, and many of them are laughing. One of the officers was Officer Craig Stevens in Millstadt, just thinking that these guys are seeing something military, or they're seeing something that, give me a break, UFO, really? And Officer Craig Stevens decides, well, I'm going to kind of drive to where they say that this object's headed. And at first he heads over to one end of town, and he sits there for a few minutes and he doesn't see anything. Then he decides to drive over to Liederkranz Park in Millstadt, where it really has a beautiful open view. And in fact, during this time of year, you can even see the lights of the Gateway Arch in downtown St. Louis from there when the trees have lost all of their leaves. And just to give the audience an idea that you can really see pretty good distance from that area and from that position. And as he's sitting here thinking, oh my God, UFO reports, really? He sees this large triangular object suddenly float overhead and over this open field in front of him. And enough to where he can see details on the back of the object. He can see the lights on the object, and he immediately gets on the radio and states, this object is above me about 500 feet and it's huge, is his exact words.
Right,
and you can hear the sincerity and the tone in his voice. And again, I have to credit these witnesses. He had the decency of mind to pop the trunk to his squad car, get his Polaroid camera out, which, they used to use back then for crime scenes and accident reports. And he tried to snap a picture, unfortunately, due to the temperature that night, and Polaroids not being exactly the best camera for nighttime photography. You really didn't capture much other than a few vague lights with a little light trail behind each one. But he did attempt to snap a picture, which I credit him for having the peace of mind to think about doing that in a moment like that. And he sees this object disappear slowly out of his view. And shortly after that, we have another officer, Officer Matt Janey of the Dupo Police Department, get on and say he sees a series of lights, but they apparently are higher and they're moving away to the northeast. Mm-hmm. So that was the initial chain of witnesses that reported seeing this object, whatever it was. And then about a year and a half later, we had Officer Mark Lopino of the O'Fallon Police Department come forward and state that he had seen the object as well, and described this triangular object with a series of very bright lights. And in point of fact, John, there's another officer that I know witnessed this UFO from another police department. I'm not going to mention the police department because when I initially started making my phone calls, I called this police department and talked to one of the dispatchers, and their response immediately was, "Oh, you need to talk to Officer so-and-so because she was on patrol and she came in saying she saw the object." But multiple attempts, both by phone, by email, by letter, went unanswered. So obviously the officer didn't want to step forward. But right. Suffice it to say, I know there's at least one other police officer that did see this UFO on that night.
So before we go forward, let's just go back to the timeline. It's about 4 a.m. or so when Melver Knoll and Highland sees this thing. And then we've got Lebanon, Shiloh, Dupo. How long of a period of time has gone on here while this thing is in somebody's vision?
Roughly a period of about an hour. Okay. We had that. It was roughly from 4 o'clock until about 5 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
Hey, this is Mike Belovich with RE/MAX Alliance. If you're looking to sell your home, before you make a decision, we need to talk today. I get homes sold. I will get you results. I think outside of the box. Even if your house is for sale by owner right now and you just have some questions on, hey, Mike, how can I make this work? Call or text me today, 618-292-0293. I am full-time. I work 7 days a week, and I will help you get your house sold. They really can't see how handsome I am, though.
James Labonte and Labonte Photography are more than just photographers. They're artists. They take great pride in capturing images that you'll be proud to place on your walls for many years for your friends and guests to admire. He's more than just someone with a fancy camera, lights, and software. He'll spend time with you, get to know you, and capture real and authentic portraits of you. For senior photos, special events, weddings, or hey, just some fun family photos you'll treasure forever. Go to Labonte Photography on Facebook or LabontePhoto.com. Say cheese. Tell me how important it is to you as a researcher that these folks are police officers and not lay people, just folks that maybe you would call their I don't want to say call them into their story into question, but their credibility, I guess, is not as high, right?
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And there's a few points I'd like to bring up in regard to that. One, police officers have a lot to lose by coming forward reporting a UFO. Their credibility in the eyes of their communities that they're representing may be called into question, again, because of the stigma associated with the UFO subject. Whereas an average person, really, we don't have too much to lose. We report a UFO. Oh, well, yeah, we don't know what John saw, but okay. But these officers have a lot on the line. They have a lot of credibility on the line, and I would even argue commercial and military pilots are in that same boat.
Right.
Their mental state can be called into question, that could impact their ability to maintain their jobs. So they have a lot to lose by coming forward, and I would argue really nothing to gain. These officers detested all of the media attention that they received after this event, and but more importantly, what's interesting about that is they have, and many skeptics will disagree with this point, but I'm still going to make it because I do believe this. Police officers are trained to assess situations versus the average layperson. When they come on the scene of a crime or when they go into a domestic violence situation, you have to quickly look at the big picture, size things up, and really look at details. And these police officers, I would argue, are trained to assess situations much more readily and quickly than the average person. And one other point I'd like to bring up, this case garnered a lot of media attention, and credible media attention, not the typical tongue-in-cheek, oh, lights in the sky, invasions by aliens. No. St. Louis media, to their credit, took this very seriously. And for any of your audience that may remember seeing some of the media coverage from that time period, they weren't laughing at this. And that is due to the fact that most of these witnesses were police officers. So the media took their accounts much more seriously than if it was just an average individual.
Yeah, I certainly remember that time. What you're saying is true. Every time something pops up, they play the X-Files theme underneath it and kind of give it a tongue in cheek, and the anchors look at each other kind of funnily. Not exactly. In this case, not in this. And you had some of the most respected, what I would call journalists in the St. Louis media covering it as well.
Yes, absolutely. And so I commend them for that.
Yeah.
Quite often we don't see that. But in this case, and again, this wasn't Billy Bob on a tractor that reported seeing UFO. These were multiple police officers. And again, one thing to add to this also, John, officers that were in radio contact with each other throughout the sequence of events. I think that's an important characteristic to also point out.
Yeah, in different locations as it moved. Slight variations between what they saw, but enough to make it similar in nature, right?
Absolutely. And I even highlight that this does illustrate how there can be varying perspectives. Again, just kind of comparing it to a car accident, you may have six witnesses. Six witnesses may tell you six variations of the same story. But I would argue that doesn't mean the car accident didn't happen. And just like this case, there may be variations in the reports, but that doesn't necessarily negate the fact that we had a mysterious object moving in the sky over southern Illinois on January 5th, 2000.
Right. So this is the core of where the case is. It's the start, Melvin Knoll, the hero, the 5 or 6 police officers with a lot of that documentation. Through
Correct.
You're the investigator. Where do you come into this story, and where do you start, and how far has it spread?
Well, I have to admit, and I hate to admit this, more often than not, when we would get UFO cases that would generate media interest, I usually can beat them to the punch. Unfortunately, I'm embarrassed to say they beat me to the punch on this one. I heard about it when it had actually already been reported by the media. And the problem from an investigative standpoint, as I'm sure your audience can appreciate, is once the media gets in there, it becomes a circus.
Okay. And
I'm trying to wade through all of these reporters, trying to get the latest scoop, trying to extract as much factual information as I can before all of this gets, before all their testimony gets tainted or twisted by the media accounts. And so, unfortunately, it was a media circus trying to actually sit down with some of these officers and witnesses and try to piece this together. And like I said, usually I can beat them to the punch, but in this case, they beat me to the punch. But really just sitting down, trying to start correlating their testimony, looking at the timeline. And you referenced my friend Daryl Barker, who did a really decent documentary on this case. Daryl, again, credit where credit's due, filed a Freedom of Information Act request to secure the dispatch tapes and the transcript of the police dispatch tapes. And what's important about that is those are time-stamped. So it's not just, well, the witness thinks it happened at 4:05. We have the timestamp when that officer actually made that transmission, describing the event. So it really helps solidify the times and more specifically the overall timeline as it relates to these UFO reports. And none of these officers are civilian witnesses said they saw an alien spacecraft. They said they don't know what they saw. It really does fit the term UFO, unidentified flying object.
Right.
Many people, including myself, initially thought, well, maybe this is something military, given the proximity of the flight path to Scott Air Force Base. We estimate that this object moved within 1 to 2 miles of Scott Air Force Base proper. And so, it's a natural conclusion to think, well, could this have been something military? Whereas Daryl Barker filed a request for information regarding the police transcripts, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with Scott Air Force Base and asked them some very pointed questions regarding this incident.
Right. You detail this letter in your book. Tell us what that said. Yeah.
I do, because it's an official document coming from Scott Air Force Base answering my questions. And the gist of it was, without going into the letter in detail, the gist of it was, were there any military operations involved that night around Scott Air Force Base? Were they in a direct or supportive role in the operation of any military vehicle at the time? And the response was negative. They had no military aircraft in the vicinity. And in fact, they even went on to state that their radar operations were down during the time of the sighting, which seemed very suspicious. I thought I was getting the runaround, but the very first lecture I gave to a live audience was in April of 2000. And to the surprise of many of your audience members, one of the gentlemen that came up after I gave my presentation at this UFO conference was a veteran employee of the FAA. So it's not all tinfoil hat people that go to these UFO conferences. You have people from aerospace, people from the FAA, commercial, military pilots that go to UFO conferences. And this gentleman came up to me immediately after I stepped off the stage and stated, Dave, if you need assistance with radar information, I can help you. I work with the FAA. And he gave me his business card to kind of prove, no, really, I do work for the FAA. And long story short, about a month after that, I had the distinct pleasure of being able to go up to the radar control tower at Lambert International Airport with my friend from the FAA, because he knew all of the gentlemen there. And in fact, he helped install the radar systems at Lambert several years prior. And so something I always have to point out, because we're looking back 18 years, this was prior to 9/11,
right.
Prior to security measures, which of course now I don't think I would have been afforded that audience, being able to go up to the control tower. But it was a great pleasure. And I will tell you, I remember going up there with my friend and him introducing me to the radar operators at Lambert Airport. And every single one of them, John, had a serious demeanor. Nobody was smiling or having smirks on their faces. And when he told them why I was there and what I was investigating, every single radar operator at Lambert was seriously interested in this case. And again, I credit the media for that, because they handled it in a very professional manner. Every single one of them was distinctly interested in this case and looked at me point blank and said, Dave, after your investigation, or as your investigation is evolving, what have you determined? They were all keenly interested in this case. I just want to let your audience know that.
Yeah.
Long story short, we were able to collect the radar data from Lambert, because their radar systems obviously were operating at the time. And in a systematic review of that radar data, we found no unidentified target that correlated with the locations and times which we had definitively pinpointed, because of the police dispatch tapes. No unidentified target was tracked on radar, but many of the radar operators told me that based on the low level sightings, because most of these witnesses stated the object was 500 to 1,000 feet in altitude, they stated because of the location of the radar array at Lambert and where these officers said they saw the objects being very low altitude, they think that it possibly could have flown literally, figuratively under the radar. And ideally, what we really needed to have was the radar data from Scott Air Force Base, because that was, as I mentioned, within a mile or two of where this object flew.
Which was conveniently not operating that night.
And again, back to that point, my friend Richard from the FAA told me that they do weekly and monthly maintenance on the radar arrays. And he said typically they do shut them down in the middle of the night or early morning hours simply because there's no air traffic at that time.
They're not operating. It's the best time to do it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I thought I was getting the runaround by the military. But Richard, very matter-of-factly, said, I know, Dave, that does sound suspicious, but that would be a time where they would shut the systems down. But what's interesting about that, it raises a larger question. Who ever was operating this vehicle? Did they know that the radar system was non-operational at that time? And did they use that window of opportunity as a time for them to fly by the military base?
Right. In your book, you also described the incident with your friend at the radar operating facility.
Yes.
Didn't someone tell you that somebody at a higher level had asked for a copy of that tape beforehand as well?
Yes. In fact, the case occurred in January 2000. I believe I'd have to check my notes, but I believe it was May or June of that year, or late April. I can't remember now. My conference was in April where I met Richard from the FAA, and we were there weeks or a month later. And Richard had stated that they cycled the radar tapes. I believe at that time it was like every 14 days, if I remember, or 30 days. And he said, of course, at this point, and by the way, this wasn't the discussion that we were having up in the control tower. We had come down the control tower and we just happened to pass the break room. And there was one gentleman there who Richard knew. And so it was like one last introduction before we left the radar facility. He goes, I want to introduce you to my friend Dave. He's investigating this UFO sighting that occurred. And again, the individual sitting there thought it was really interesting, the case. He wasn't laughing about it or anything of that nature. And he said, he goes, I was telling Dave earlier that, due to the passage of time, they would have already recycled those radar tapes and, that data wouldn't be there anymore. And thank God we happened to stop in the break room when we did. This gentleman looked at Richard dead in the eye and said, no, it isn't. He goes, we got an order from someone to pull that radar data. And Richard, you could have knocked him over with a feather. The look he gave me, he's like, what? He goes, yeah. And he referenced someone that worked there at the radar control center. He said, so-and-so got a request from higher up to pull that radar data. He goes, he's got a copy of it sitting on his desk. And Richard just about fell over, literally. He took like a step back and just utter disbelief. And long story short, through his assistance, we were able to gather that radar data. Again, unfortunately, it didn't yield any results. Yeah. But it was interesting to have that level of cooperation and to be able to not only have the police dispatch tapes, but to have radar data. It's not often we're afforded that opportunity to have that much material.
So, David, let's talk about the military aspect of this. I see my assumption is it's some government thing. The police officers involved assume it's a military or government thing, or not our government, but a terrestrial craft operating in the shadows.
Absolutely.
Most of the time, folks, if you're and anyone that's listening up to this point in the show already is going, it's by an Air Force base. It's probably an Air Force thing. That's everyone's immediate thing. As you said, as a researcher, your primary objective is to eliminate what it isn't and leave what it is.
Yeah, why? UFO is the last explanation we're going to gravitate towards.
So why isn't this, in your opinion, a military thing or object that was seen on January 5th, 2000?
Well, first off, we have to, as I mentioned, look back 10 years prior to this event. We had this unprecedented wave of sightings by military over Belgium, describing the exact same type of object, behaving in the exact same way, similar lighting characteristics. And we're talking hundreds, if not thousands, of eyewitnesses. More importantly, the Belgian military sent 2 F-16s up to attempt to identify one of these UFOs one particular night in 1990. And they were able to lock on multiple times with onboard radar systems. Each time they locked on to the UFO, this UFO would take off at incredible speeds, going supersonic again, but not generating a sonic boom. So right there is a correlation to the January 5th, 2000 case. But every time they would lock onto this UFO, it would take off. It would increase in altitude or decrease in altitude and pull an incredible amount of Gs to the point where they said it would kill a human pilot. A human pilot could not withstand that type of G-force. And so we have that case on record. But in looking at the historical record, which I started doing when I realized there was a connection between Belgium and Southern Illinois, I started reviewing newspapers, military files, both United States as well as British Ministry of Defense files, and other case files around the world. And I started looking to see that there is a pattern of reporting of these large triangular objects moving in a very non-aerodynamic fashion. And when you really look at the totality of evidence, it really begs the question, especially when you see these reports going back to 1930, 1940, and they're describing the same object. I mean, if we had this in our arsenal in January 5th, 2000, here we are in 2018, I would think by now information would have leaked out about this being a military object, or that we would have aircraft today that surpass the technology from 2000. But I've talked to aviation and aerospace experts from Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, and they state that we have no aircraft that can perform like this object did in January 2000. And in fact, I mentioned in my book, Dr. Paul Ziss, now deceased, taught at Parks Air College in St. Louis University. He was head of the aviation department there. And I did an interview with him right before he died of cancer in 2013. And I asked him, because when the media investigated this case, they went to Dr. Ziss, because he was the local aviation expert. Anytime there was an aircraft crash or anytime there was new developments in aerospace, he was always the local resident expert that they would go to. Mm-hmm. And he had 30 plus years working for McDonnell Douglas and Boeing in the area of advanced propulsion technology. So, you know, you asked me what my opinion is. I'll defer to the expert. I'll defer to Dr. Ziss. And I asked him when I was writing my book, you know, Dr. Ziss, I know you were approached and asked about this case when it happened. Now, here we are years later, 2013, when I talked to him. Here we are in 2013 with a passage of time and with over 30 years in the area of advanced propulsion technology. And by the way, he worked on many compartmentalized classified projects in this area. I mean, this is the guy to talk to. I asked him, with the passage of time, looking back now, 13 years on this case, do you believe that was technology that we had, or do you think it was indicative or suggestive of maybe someone else's technology? And he said, if it was just a triangular object, I would think it might be something that you might see at Edwards Air Force Base. In other words, we have triangular aircraft, the B-2, F-117A, et cetera. But he stated the ability for this object to be completely silent, for it to go supersonic and not generate a sonic boom. He said, based on the flight characteristics, in his professional opinion, and I'll defer to him, he's the expert, he stated he believes it was someone else's technology.
And by someone else's, we're not talking Russians.
Non-terrestrial.
Right, yeah.
Not Korean, not Russian.
Yeah.
And if we had this technology, again, why are we dealing with like F-22 jet aircraft? I mean, that it just seems ludicrous when we see what is, as far as we know today, cutting edge technology, and we look back to this technology in 2000. And again, these objects are being reported worldwide. In fact, just one example, we could spend all day talking about this, but just one example I'd like to mention to the audience. In doing my historical review, the Danish Defense Intelligence Service, way back in November of 1957, reported, and I'm using their words, not mine, in the media, they were reporting, and in the military reports, triangular spaceships being reported over Denmark.
Wow.
And they described large, dark, triangular platforms in the sky that were maneuvering in very similar fashion to what was described in Belgium in 1990 and in Southern Illinois in 2000. And I even found a Reuters News Service article that describes a sighting in April of 1958 during the same wave of sightings over Denmark. It started in November and went into the spring of 1958. And this is being investigated by the Danish Defense Intelligence Service. A Reuters news service reporter went out, and a team of reporters went out and interviewed a woman in the village of Brohyr in Denmark. And she described a large, dark, silent, triangular object, spaceship, again, their term, that was seen. And objects were seen coming out of this triangular object. And it goes on further in the Reuters news service article that the Reuters reporters interviewed 20 other villagers that basically corroborated what this woman was telling them.
Yeah.
And so that's just one of, as you know, John, you've read the book, one of hundreds of reports spanning the decades worldwide of these triangular objects. And at some point, you have to concede that there might be more here than just military hardware.
Well, in my own personal research, I just read the book. I think it's Ben Rich, who was at the Skunk Works, Lockheed.
Yeah. Yep.
And detailed really how, they came up with stealth technology, the F-117, and how they can get things down to looking like a bird on a radar. And I'll go back to, they also built the U-2. They built the SR-71, the Blackbird. They built the F-117. They were working on stealth ships. And as you mentioned, in terms of timing, disclosure, I think the SR-71 was secret for, I want to say 6 years. Don't quote me on that. The F-117 in development for a while, but flying for maybe 4 to 5 in secrecy before it's out there. We're on the 19th, almost the 19th anniversary of just the Illinois incident. You're detailing things back to the early 1900s, if I think right in your book.
The earliest account actually is from Scientific American. I'm actually looking at the bound edition here in my research room. I actually finally acquired an original copy. Actually, astronomers saw 2 triangular UFOs moving across the lunar surface way back in 1882.
Yeah, so there you go. We're 140 years almost of sightings of these. And our folks in our government, with what we've developed, even in terms of just disclosing a black project, a couple of, less than a decade in most cases.
But John, for the audience, let me concede this point, though. I've stated repeatedly, if, let's say in 2019, the Air Force comes out and unveils this triangular aircraft that fits the description physically, has performance capabilities that were demonstrated and observed by these police officers back in 2000, I'd be the first to concede, okay, there we go. We have an explanation. We have an answer to this case.
Yeah, you'd be the happiest guy in the world because there is an answer.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. Let's close the books on this case. We have an answer now, a prosaic explanation. But Daryl Barker, who you alluded to, he did the documentary on this case. He did a remake of it, and it was, I believe, the 10-year anniversary. So it was, 2010? And I think I made a prediction and I think this video clip's on my website also, where you can go and see it. I made a prediction that, people are saying 10 years after this incident, it's military. We haven't seen a military craft unveiled. If we look at the 20th anniversary or the 30th anniversary, how long are we going to continue this narrative and say it's military when this military aircraft has never been unveiled or declassified? So at some point, where's the statute of limitations when it comes to this explanation on this case? But I would be the first to acknowledge if the military unveiled an aircraft that fits this description, that, okay, there we go. There's the answer to this case. Until that happens, we have to label this case a genuine unidentified flying object, UFO. Doesn't mean alien spacecraft, but it is an unknown at this point.
What was the turning point for you, David, that turned you into an author and decided to go back and really start researching this and present your case?
Well, I started as a UFO enthusiast and then became a investigator researcher. I never thought I was going to be a UFO author. Never thought I'd write a book, period. But what really was the impetus for that, John, was the fact that years after this case occurred, people were getting on the internet. And of course, we know this happens with every subject, right? Instant experts, armchair researchers, hopping on the internet, putting on blogs and putting on websites their explanation for this case. Never mind the fact they never went out and interviewed anybody. Never mind the fact they're in a foreign country and don't even know the topography of where this sighting occurred.
Mm-hmm.
You had all these people that were self-proclaimed experts weighing in on this case, yet they hadn't done one iota of actual research. If anything, they just read my report or saw Daryl Barker's documentary, and based on that, they were suddenly developing their suppositions on what did or did not happen. And so it started to really frustrate me. And then I started to see people making comments, well, we know these triangular UFOs didn't really appear on the scene until the development of stealth technology. And I'm sitting there reading that, and literally here in my research room, I'm looking at declassified Ministry of Defense files from the 1950s and 60s describing triangular UFOs that behaved and are described almost identical to what these police officers saw. And so really, I hate to say it, the book developed out of frustration because I felt like I need to set the record straight. These people are making statements that are demonstrably false. And so I started weaving all this material together and really felt like I needed to present this. And by that, I meant present it to UFO conferences where I lectured. And in doing my presentation at several conferences, it wasn't until the Eureka Springs UFO conference in beautiful Eureka Springs, Arkansas, where I had lectured many times before, in 2012, in April of 2012, I gave an updated and revised presentation and looking at all of these reports. And another lecturer that happened to be there, who I had known of but did not know him personally, was Colonel John Alexander. And Colonel Alexander is a former Green Beret, retired Army colonel who was in charge of non-lethal weapons development at Los Alamos here in New Mexico, where I live now. And John, and I've gotten to know him over the years, is one of those people that you say he does not suffer fools. Uh-huh. And in other words, he disagrees with a lot of claims made by UFO researchers, and rightly so, because sometimes they're not backed up with evidence or facts. And I remember stepping off the stage at the conclusion of my presentation, and as I'm talking to various audience members, there were about 500 people there, talking to various people coming up, asking me questions, I saw this gentleman kind of weaving his way through the audience, and it was Colonel Alexander. And he put his hand out and he goes, "I just want to shake your hand." And to quote him, he said, "That's one of the best damn presentations I've ever heard on the subject in many, many years at one of these conferences."
Right.
And that led to me sharing additional information with him because I really piqued his interest. And I had 3 or 4 or 5 people after my lecture come up to me and say, "I want to buy a copy of your book. Are you selling your book downstairs?" which is where the vendor area was. And I was embarrassed because, one, I didn't reference I had a book because I didn't have a book at the time. But these people assumed that I did. And then Colonel Alexander, with his interest in my research, I decided that maybe I should consider putting all this into a book and really setting the record straight. And so it was for those reasons that I decided to start putting this to paper. And ultimately, word leaked out that I was working on it. And my friend and colleague in the UFO field, Richard Dolan, heard about it. And actually on an interview that I was doing with him live, he called me out and said, "Dave," he goes, "I know you're working on this. I know it's not done, but once you're done with it, I'm willing to publish it once you finish it." So for a first-time author, it was really gratifying to know I'm not going through all this effort for maybe nothing, because you write a book and then you try to find a publisher. I had a publisher ready to print this and it wasn't even finished. So I was very fortunate in that regard. And since then, the book's really generated a lot of positive feedback, both on the internet as well as in the UFO community. And I've even had some researchers, MUFON investigators, and this was really gratifying, come up to me and tell me, "We use your book as a field guide. If we get a report of a triangular UFO, we have your book there to see how it correlates with the patterns and the characteristics that you've outlined." So it's really gratifying that it's not just a book that can be read and enjoyed, but it's almost being used as a field manual by many UFO investigators.
Now. It's a textbook.
It's a textbook.
Yeah. David, I could talk to you all day long. I swear to God. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. A couple of more questions just to kind of maybe tie this subject off. But
Sure.
I tell you, I'd love to have you back on at some point, just explore
Absolutely.
some more of this part of the phenomena that we have. But is this, in your estimation, with what we saw, not what we saw, you or I, but what was seen here in Central Illinois, is it tie in at all, in your opinion, to the Phoenix Lights in 97?
You know, I've had that question raised, and the long and short answer is I just don't know. The performance characteristics, the way this object flew, the silent flight, etc., the very slow flight. These objects move so slow. Some people said they could actually walk down the sidewalk and keep up with it. Obviously, it's not moving fast enough to generate lift like we would have with conventional aircraft in that regard. So we're dealing with some other type of propulsion technology, apparently. Some people have suggested, well, could they be blimps? Could they be lighter than air vehicles? And I certainly considered that. But the one thing that negated that as a plausible explanation, and Dr. Paul Ziss, in conversations with him, he agreed with this as well, and he was very firm on this point. If this object or these objects, like the Phoenix Lights, were moving at a leisurely pace and they continued to do so, you could most readily subscribe this to a blimp or lighter than air vehicle. However, when you couple that with the extreme rate of acceleration, a dirigible, a lighter than air vehicle, does not have the structural integrity to withstand that type of stress put on the vehicle. So it fits some of the facts, but not all of the facts as an explanation. But the Phoenix Lights case, it could fall into the category. We have different types of UFOs being reported: discs, orbs, triangles, boomerangs. I would argue that the Phoenix Lights case was almost more of a boomerang or flying V than a true equilateral triangle. But the propulsion technologies that are being employed could be similar. There could be underlying characteristics that are similar. So I just don't know. And of course, the Phoenix Lights case, this object was huge. I mean, they estimate this thing was at least a mile or two wide. Right. Which really stretches the imagination. But again, we have multiple witnesses, hundreds if not thousands, and something on this case too, John, I always like to point out, we call it the Phoenix Lights for a good reason. The majority of witnesses were in Phoenix proper, in the surrounding neighborhoods. But really, we should almost call it, the Arizona Lights, because the witnesses, as you probably know, stretched down the entire state before it even reached the greater Phoenix area.
Right.
So
over hours, yes. Yeah.
Oh, yes. And again, like the January 5th, 2000 case, you can kind of connect the dots as you plot where these witnesses were. And in fact, it passed over Phoenix and continued all the way down to the southern portion of the state, where we finally have the object disappear. But it does demonstrate that these reports do occur. They're cited by multiple eyewitnesses. And I would argue, and I would put to your audience, people are seeing something. The question is, what is it? And you may subscribe to a military explanation for all of these reports, and that's fine. We're all entitled to our opinion. But at the end of the day, whether we say it's a genuine UFO, whether we say it's military, we have to have evidence to back that up.
Yeah.
I mean, in the absence of evidence, all we have is an opinion.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about opinion. What is your opinion? What's your hypothesis without true explanation about what we're seeing, what's going on?
If I was pressed for an explanation on this particular case, the January 5th, 2000 case, again, and I say this very carefully, because of my exhaustive historical examination of these reports, because we're now, as you said, coming up on the 19th anniversary of this case, and because there's all these other cases out there that mirror this, I truly think that this is not something that was military in origin. I think this is someone else's technology. And again, I don't just pull that out of the air because it's wide-eyed belief in UFOs. I would go back to Dr. Ziss. I trust his expertise in this area of advanced propulsion technology. If he thinks it was someone else's technology, then I'm inclined to go with the expert.
Yeah. So it's not so much what you think it is, but what you're pretty clear it's not. I guess is the best way to say it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we really can't say what it was, but I think that whatever this object was, it transcends any technology that we're close to mastering at this point. And certainly not just Dr. Ziss, but other aerospace experts have weighed in on this. And even Colonel Alexander, who wrote the foreword to my book, he states that he doesn't believe that this is military. He made a very good point, again, and I defer to him with his military expertise. I always like to say, John, I'm not intelligent, but I just try to surround myself with intelligent people.
Likewise. That's why I called you today, David.
But, Colonel Alexander, John Alexander brings up a good point. He states when a military craft is designed, it is designed with a purpose. What is the purpose of these large, silent, triangular platforms being seen around the world, but I might add, never seen in areas of military conflicts? Isn't that interesting?
It is.
If this is military, how come we're not seeing it over in Afghanistan or Iraq, where we have military operations taking place? Why is it being seen over cornfields in Illinois? Why is it being seen in Connecticut in 1960 over a wheat field? It really begs that question.
Yeah. Another question I was going to ask you was like, everything's got lights. What I saw was not lights. It just blocked it out. Why do they use lights?
And that question came up in Wyoming. And again, speculation on my part, always prefaced by saying that. But my belief is that these lights, at least on these triangular UFOs, I'm not talking all UFOs, but at least these triangular UFOs, based on their positioning in some cases and based on like changes depending on certain maneuvers, I don't think they're lights as such. I think they're actually some type of inherent part of the propulsion technology.
Propulsion. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and because people have said, if these things want to be stealthy, why are they lighting themselves up like Christmas trees? Well, maybe they have no choice. Again, we're thinking lights from an FAA perspective, but what people are observing may be actually engines or propulsion technology.
Couple of more questions, David. Big picture. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day saying I was going to interview you, and we were talking about what these things could be. And he said, he goes, with all the cameras in the world, why aren't we seeing more of this stuff? And I thought, well, it's a great question. But the question I really want to ask you is that creating more noise, or is it creating more credibility to what we do see?
It's creating more noise, I would argue, John. And the reason I say that is, to your friend's point, there are photos, there are videos. Just go on YouTube and type in triangular UFO. You're going to see a plethora of videos. The problem with that is, and I made this point recently at the conference I alluded to that I attended in Wyoming recently, we are getting more quantity of reports, but I would argue we're getting lower quality reports. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean, we're getting anonymous UFO videos posted to YouTube by, UFO Bob at yahoo.com. And we don't know who UFO Bob is. And the other thing that we have, and I would argue this has occurred just since 2000 in a huge way, is the increase in technology as it relates to digital manipulation.
Right.
With Photoshop, with digital, video manipulation. You can get any high school kid today that is semi-savvy on a computer, and they can generate a very believable looking UFO video. And I would argue probably 98.9% of the videos that are on YouTube are probably fabricated or misidentifications. So the videos are out there, but I'm not a video expert, so I'm not going to weigh in on those videos. And the time and resources involved in trying to track down every single witness to every UFO video posted on YouTube, as you can imagine, that would exhaust anybody's resources. Right. And so I don't focus on that. I don't focus on photos. Again, I have a friend that's a photo expert. I can defer to him if ever I personally receive anything like that. But I guess you can say over the passage of time, I've kind of fallen into that category of investigator / historical researcher. And the one thing that I do have, and I'm sitting here looking at filing cabinets and bookcases all around me, I have decades worth of international UFO files, news clippings, and reports. And that's something that I can tap into readily and look at. And that's really what I tried to do with the book, is to try to share that information. And I would argue anybody that's out there listening to, our discussion, reserve judgment. Don't subscribe to the UFO theory. Don't subscribe to the military theory. Read my book, look at the information that I've gathered, and then develop your opinion. And I would say that as if we were in a court of law. You don't go in as a juror and go in with a preconceived conclusion. You weigh the totality of evidence and then develop your opinion. So I would just ask people to do that. Weigh the evidence before you weigh in on this case or any other case.
One final thing. If somebody's out there listening and they've seen something in the past or they see something in the future and kind of recall back to this conversation, as a researcher investigator, what's your best advice for someone to explore that? Is it to get a hold of MUFON? What's your best advice?
Well, the first advice I would give that person is immediately sit down and write and document and sketch what you observed. If you observe something with a group of individuals, separate yourselves. Everybody go into a separate room and write down what you observed, sketch it out, draw it, and then put all your reports together, but don't taint each other. Again, this is very similar to what police officers would do, separate the witnesses so they're not tainting or influencing each other. And the first thing is to immediately document as much as you can recall, because memory is fluid. It does change over time, and in some cases, very short amount of time. Once you've done that, I would recommend contacting the National UFO Reporting Center and or the Mutual UFO Network, or reach out to myself.
Well, awesome advice. Your book, we've referenced the entire interview. Triangular UFOs, an estimate of the situation. They can find it everywhere, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's on Amazon. That's where I got it. And then your website is?
It's www.davidmarler, MARLER, UFO.com.
Anything you'd want to say to the citizens here of Central Illinois?
No, just that I miss Illinois. I'm looking forward to coming back for the Thanksgiving holiday and visiting with my 89-year-old mother. Looking forward to seeing her. And I certainly miss Illinois. I'm out here in the desert now, but I do miss the seasons out there. And I certainly have a lot of fond memories growing up in Southern Illinois.
Well, you mentioned missing the seasons. We missed fall. we went straight from summer to winter. It's just crazy.
Yeah,
here.
Well, hopefully you have a nice spring to look forward to next year.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all your time today, David. Once again, I could talk to you all day long about this stuff. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you, John.
Well, that was David Marler. Can't thank him enough for coming on. That was a great episode, if you ask me. I enjoyed it so much, and it is kind of a watershed moment to me here at the What's That Like podcast. One of the things I wanted to get on here for a while is someone like David to talk about this phenomena. You heard me talk about my own sighting. I don't know what it was. I can't tell you what it was. Obviously, David didn't tell me that he knew what it was. It didn't fit the description of the black triangles to a T that certainly he has researched, but he's heard of similar things at times as well. I can't thank him enough for coming on and also for providing the recording that we listened to at the beginning of the police officers involved. So if you want, go do your own research. There's more out there. Go to YouTube. Just search for UFOs over Southern Illinois. Go search for the Illinois UFO, January 5th, The Edge of Reality. There's a documentary out there that was produced by David Barker that you can watch. It's got the preface on it by David Marler. Search David Marler on there. You'll find it. Lots of great information on this. Do we get all the answers? No. Did we get David's opinion? Yes. I think it was very well done what David was able to explain to us, and you can certainly go find more information if you'd like. It was a great discussion I had. I'm happy I'm able to bring it to you here in Central Illinois, because I know many of you probably remember the incident. It was well covered by St. Louis media, Rocky Madden, Lisa Zigman, all the different news stations were involved. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch got involved. And then, of course, it got picked up nationally at times as well. Big event. Happy to recap it. And I encourage you to go do even more research. And of course, pick up David's book, Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation. I got it on Amazon, and I'll give you a chance to win one right here. You noticed last week I had a trivia contest for the offer to win a copy of Kalen's book, Haunted Carlinville, History and Hauntings of Macoupin County. I'm going to give you a chance to win David Marler's book. So here's all you got to do. Message me. Here's the trivia question. The trivia question. Oh, by the way, I should go back and say Martin Chauvet. He was the winner of Kalen's book. So thanks for messaging me, Martin. I appreciate that. The copy of the book. I got your information. I'll be sending that to you via Amazon. Thanks a lot. So you're going to get a clean copy. Just watch for the package in the mail. And then I want to give one away this time as well. So here's this week's trivia question on the What's That Like podcast. What's the name of the place that I broadcast from every Friday night for the Queen of Hearts? You know I'm on there every Friday night, bringing you the Queen of Hearts drawing live from blank. Message me the name of said place. Just shoot me an instant message. Don't comment on one of the posts because everybody will do it. I'll look at the first 10 people that send me in a message, and I'll pick one of those first 10 and send you a copy of David Marler's book, Triangular UFOs, An Estimate of the Situation. So there you have it. That was this week's edition of the What's That Like podcast. You can tell it's been a long episode. I'm not even going to try to get Greg Shively on. He's still in Europe anyway. He went to see U2, and he's been touring Lake Como. I think he went to George Clooney's house or something. Some future episode, we'll find out what's that like. But anyway, I've been John Knowles. That's been producer Bob. Peace out. What's That Like is available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Search for What's That Like. Subscribe today and never miss an episode. Streaming is available at SoundCloud.com and on the SoundCloud app. Follow What's That Like at Facebook.com/What's That Like Podcast and on Twitter at What's That Like Pod. All opinions of the guests of the What's That Like podcast are their own, not necessarily the views of the host or the podcast producers. We hope you enjoy this podcast serving Central Illinois and beyond. Peace out!